The shared meal, bonds forged over fire and food. The smell of roasting fish filled the air, mingling with the fragrant aroma of simmering herbs and the faint salty tang of the nearby sea. The warm glow of enchanted lanterns flickered across the stone walls, casting soft, wavering shadows that made the chamber feel alive, pulsing with quiet energy. For the first time in days, perhaps weeks, Krys and his team sat around a table not in haste, not in exhaustion, but in something close to peace. The tension that had weighed so heavily on their shoulders had not vanished, but here, in the heart of Vitmori's domain, it loosened just enough to allow them to breathe. Jaren leaned back, stretching his broad shoulders as he eyed the meal before them. "Damn," he muttered, rubbing his hands together. "Didn't expect something this good underground." Lyra smirked, twirling a dagger between her fingers. "You were expecting stale rations and moldy bread, weren't you?" "Wouldn't be the first time," he admitted. Vitmori, seated at the head of the table, observed them with quiet amusement. Though he did not eat, his presence was felt, his watchful gaze absorbing every detail of their interactions. "You've been running on scraps and street food for weeks," Vitmori said. "You need real nourishment." Krys, ever the strategist, studied the table before them. It was not an extravagant feast by noble standards. There were no golden platters or imported delicacies, but it was far more than any of them had expected. Bowls of steaming fish stew, rich with depth and warmth, sat alongside plates of roasted shellfish, their shells cracked open to reveal the tender meat within. Flatbreads, crisp at the edges and soft in the center, had been laid out with a selection of spreads, herbed butter, smoked salt, and something that smelled faintly of citrus and spice. There was even a selection of root vegetables, roasted to a golden crisp, glistening with oil and fresh herbs. It was a meal made not for indulgence, but for restoration. Lyra raised an eyebrow, glancing at Vitmori. "You cook too?" Vitmori shook his head.
No.
"But those who serve this domain do." At his words, figures emerged from the shadows. Constructs, humanoid yet distinctly inhuman, their movements precise as they moved to place the last dishes on the table before retreating once more. They did not speak, nor did they show any sign of emotion, but their craftsmanship was evident in every dish. Jaren eyed them warily. "Creepy." Lyra chuckled. "Efficient." Krys, however, was less interested in the constructs and more in the meaning behind this gesture. He glanced at Vitmori, his expression unreadable. "Why do this?" Vitmori met his gaze evenly. "Because you need it." Simple words. Direct words. But they carried a weight that silenced the room for a moment. Then, Jaren, never one to overthink things, grabbed a piece of flatbread and scooped up a generous portion of stew. "Well, whatever the reason, I'm not complaining," he said before taking a hearty bite. The moment the flavors hit his tongue, his eyes widened slightly. "All right," he admitted after swallowing. "This is good." That was all the encouragement the others needed. Lyra, ever the cautious one, took her first bite with measured curiosity. The moment the broth hit her tongue, she let out a soft hum of appreciation. It was rich, layered with the kind of depth that only came from careful preparation. The fish was tender, the spices subtle, but enhancing every note. She didn't say anything. Words weren't necessary. She simply reached for another piece of bread and dipped it into the broth. Krys took his time, eating methodically, but even he couldn't deny that this was the best meal he had eaten in weeks. He had survived on travel rations, street food, and whatever scraps they could afford to spare. This was something else. It wasn't just the food itself. It was what it represented. It was a moment of normalcy, a reminder of something human amidst the chaos of their lives. As the meal went on, the conversation shifted. At first, they spoke of simple things, complaints about long travels, the worst food they had ever eaten, the strangest inns they had stayed in. Jaren regaled them with a particularly colorful tale of an innkeeper who had tried to serve them meat stew that turned out to be something far less identifiable. Lyra rolled her eyes. "You're still talking about that?" "It smelled like old boots," Jaren argued. "I'm still convinced it was old boots." Laughter rippled through the group, genuine, unguarded. Even Krys, usually reserved, smirked at the memory. And then, slowly, the conversation shifted to deeper matters. To the capital. To the missing people. To the unease that had driven them here in the first place. The city feels wrong, Krys admitted, setting down his spoon. Like there's something rotting just beneath the surface. Jaren nodded grimly. Yeah. And whatever it is, it's patient. Waiting. Lyra traced a finger along the rim of her cup, her expression thoughtful. It's one thing to make people disappear. It's another to do it so quietly that no one notices until it's too late. A silence settled over the table once more, heavier than before. Then Vitmori spoke. It means they are careful, the lingering threat, shadows that do not sleep. The warmth of the shared meal had settled in their stomachs, but the comfort it brought was fleeting. As the flickering light of the enchanted torches cast long shadows along the smooth stone walls, a familiar heaviness crept back into the air. The kind that weighed on the soul, pressing in from the edges of the mind, whispering of dangers yet unseen. Krys had felt it long before they had arrived in Vitmori's domain. A presence, a shadow at the edges of his vision, never quite in focus, but always there. It had started subtly at first, glances exchanged in the streets of the capital, whispers that stopped just before he could catch them, footsteps that seemed to follow but never approached. But then the disappearances had escalated. People who should have had no connection to one another, beggars, lowlifes, and even a few unfortunate merchants, vanishing like smoke in the wind. And no one spoke of it. The city moved on, its people unwilling to look too closely, as if acknowledging the threat would make it real. But it was real. And Krys knew, deep in his gut, that whatever force was at play was not finished. Not yet. He sat now, watching the others settle in, but his mind remained distant. Across from him, Jaren was checking his weapons, running a cloth along the edge of his sword with a steady, practiced motion. Lyra had positioned herself near the entrance, back against the wall, her posture deceptively relaxed. But Krys knew her well enough to recognize the tension in her shoulders, the sharpness in her eyes. She felt it too, the presence, the threat. Vitmori, however, was unreadable. He remained standing near the far end of the chamber, his gaze thoughtful but distant, as though he were listening to something none of them could hear. And perhaps he was. You feel it too, don't you? Krys finally asked, his voice quiet but firm. Vitmori's gaze shifted to him, studying him for a moment before answering. Yes. The simplicity of the reply sent a ripple of unease through the room. Jaren set down his blade, frowning. You mean here? Inside your domain. Vitmori shook his head. Not here. Not yet. Lyra exhaled through her nose. But it's close. It wasn't a question. Vitmori inclined his head slightly. Closer than you think. The weight of those words settled over them, pressing into their chests like a physical force. For all his strange, inhuman presence, Vitmori had never been the type to speak without purpose. If he said something was near, then it was. Jaren's grip tightened around the hilt of his sword. Then why the hell are we just sitting here? Because running headfirst into the dark without understanding what lurks there is the quickest way to be swallowed by it, Vitmori said calmly. Krys met his gaze, searching for any sign of hesitation, of uncertainty. He found none. Then what is lurking out there, he pressed. Vitmori was quiet for a moment, as if considering how much to reveal. Then, finally he spoke. There are two kinds of threats in this world, he said. The ones you can see, and the ones you can't. Lyra's brow furrowed. And which one are we dealing with? Vitmori's expression darkened. Both. Silence. Deep. Heavy. Unyielding. A distant sound echoed through the chamber. Faint. Indistinct. Like the shifting of air in a tunnel, or the rustling of fabric against stone. It was gone as soon as it came, but it sent a shiver down Krys's spine. Jaren sat up straighter, his instincts sharpening. Tell me that was one of your constructs, he muttered. Vitmori remained still. No. Krys rose to his feet. Then what was it? Vitmori closed his eyes for a brief moment. When he opened them again, his voice was steady. Something watching? A chill ran through the group. Lyra swore under her breath, her fingers twitching toward her dagger. Then we do have a problem. Vitmori's gaze remained locked on the darkened corridor leading deeper into his domain. Yes, he said. But not in the way you think. Jaren let out a humorless laugh. Oh, that's comforting. Krys clenched his jaw. He had spent his life facing danger, fighting bandits, navigating political intrigues, surviving in the harshest of conditions. But this was something different. Something unnatural. And worse still, he knew that it was aware of them, just as they were becoming aware of it. Then what do we do? Krys asked, his voice controlled despite the tension coiling in his chest. Vitmori turned his gaze back to them, his expression unreadable. For now, he said. We wait. Jaren scowled. Wait? For what? For whatever the hell is out there to decide we're easy pickings. Vitmori shook his head. No. We wait because we are not the only ones being watched. Krys frowned. What do you mean? Vitmori's eyes darkened. I mean that whoever is behind these disappearances, whoever is pulling the strings, they are not simply acting in secrecy anymore. They are testing us, measuring how much we know. Final thought, the weight of what comes next. The flickering torches cast wavering shadows along the stone walls, their glow steady but subdued. The air was heavy with unspoken words, the weight of realization pressing down on the group like an unseen hand. Krys sat with his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the worn surface of the table before him. The meal had been finished, the plates pushed aside, yet no one had moved. There was something binding them to this moment, an unspoken understanding that the world beyond these walls would not wait for them to be ready. Vitmori, ever watchful, stood motionless at the far end of the room, his presence both grounding